everyone, and welcome on this very sunny, lovely, hot day. We are so welcome to have so many of you join us today. This live interview is brought together in partnership with Time for Geography and also with UE Bristol as well. So today we are very excited. I'm very excited to be joined, but with Dr. Harry West, to investigate how geographers use GIS to understand human and physical processes. So Dr. Harry West is a programme leader for BSc Geography and senior lecturer in Geography and Environmental Management, and he's a specialist in GIS or Geographical Information Systems and has travelled globally to undertake his research. So today we're going to explore how Harry uses GIS in his research and offer advice to students using GIS for their geographical research. So whether you are doing your NEA or whether you're in a different year group, or if you're just interested in GIS, hopefully you'll get lots of ideas from this. So I'm going to pass over to Harry, and if you wouldn't mind, Harry, starting by telling us, what is GIS?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie, and hello, everyone. So sometimes in quite a lot of different textbooks and things, you might come across two different definitions as to what GIS actually stands for, which can make it a bit tricky to pin down a definition sometimes. In geography, we quite often refer to the idea of geographic information systems, and that's essentially referring to the use of software on computers or hardware to collect, manage, analyze, and present geographic information and spatial data sets to really help us understand spatial processes and communicate these to a wider audience. In a way, GIS is quite often described really as the where and the what of geographic data. And Esri, one of the big kind of software developers, they're a bit like the Apple of the GIS world. They sometimes refer to the GIS being the science of where, which I think is a really nice way of capturing all the things that it can do. And sometimes though, you hear the phrase geographic information science being used as well. And quite often that's used to refer to the concepts and the theories behind those more applied systems. And so that can kind of stray more into the realms of computer or data science, really. But quite often in geography, we see geographic information systems. But yeah, the terms quite often can kind of get interchanged with each other. And really, kind of whether you know it or not, it's very likely that GIS is already a part of your daily life. If you've got a smartphone, it's probably tracking your location and recording that spatial data, and has things like the mapping apps. And for many people, that was probably a bit of an unknown until the COVID pandemic. When we were asked in the UK by the government to download the Track and Trace app. And that app was constantly kind of tracking our location, seeing if we encountered any people who had tested positive, and using it to check into key locations like sort of bars or supermarkets. And so I think for many people at the time, that seemed a bit of an alien concept and a bit of an uncomfortable idea. But in reality, there was a good chance their phone was doing that in the background anyway, perhaps without them knowing. So essentially what's quite interesting is that is a form of GIS, as an app which generated and analysed a spatial process, even if that spatial process was just us kind of going to the supermarket, really. But more broadly, in terms of kind of geography, GIS has a really broad range of applications, from geography and environmental management and beyond as well. We see people working in kind of business studies or economics or history, architecture, all using GIS as part of their studies and their jobs. And it's really used in the real world, in the business world, to help understand spatial processes, whether that be something like looking at animal species or vegetation in ecology, or analysing demographic information from census records and how that's changed over time. GIS is really used at its kind of maximum potential to help organisations make better decisions. And that could be anything from where to build a new supermarket to the safest evacuation route following a flood event. The number of potential applications is pretty limitless.
Fantastic, thank you. Can we go, so we've kind of talked about how GIS is used in our everyday life, and also by loads of organisations when they're making decisions about important things or analysing kind of data spatially. So how can GIS help geographers understand physical and human geography?
Yeah, so if I start on the physical side, then jump over to the human in a moment, in no particular order, I will say. So kind of in physical geography, GIS can be used in so many different applications. It can do anything from helping us understand spatial patterns in climate and how that might be changing in different parts of the world, through to understanding that the distribution of significant earthquakes around tectonic plate boundaries, and kind of beyond looking at the distributions and understanding spatial patterns. We can also use GIS to start to model different scenarios for us and understand how we might better manage the environment. For example, we can model a major flood event in a major urban area, and then be able to calculate the number of buildings, the length of roads, etc., which would be at risk from a flood event of that scale, and what the cost damages from that might be. And then what's kind of really powerful in going back to the use of GIS for decision making is that we could then simulate different management strategies to see how we might mitigate that risk. If we build a sea wall of 5 meters high, what does that do to that model flood event? Does it protect the properties behind, or do we need to do something further? So we can kind of model and simulate different scenarios, and that can help us make more informed decisions. And kind of in GIS, we also have to think about where we can access sort of key data sets from a lot of the time. So quite often we can collect really valuable data for physical geography studies using satellites. We can use satellites quite often from organizations like NASA or the European Space Agency, for a more local example, to kind of capture pretty good resolution images of everywhere on the Earth's surface, roughly every 10 days or so, sometimes even less, depending on your latitude. And for some satellites, we've got those images going back to the 1970s when NASA launched their Landsat program. And those images are really, really powerful to help us understand how our planet's changing. Whether that be looking at kind of deforestation rates in the Amazon and the quite scary pictures we see of the rates of deforestation there, or looking at something like glacial retreat and seeing how that's been retreating over the past 30 years or so. So data generated by those kind of satellites and those images are really, really powerful in helping us sort of understand those key sort of climate and biodiversity issues that we're facing today. Thinking about the kind of the human geography side, there's an equal number of applications exploring our human and built environments. Quite often, GIS is used to explore things like changing demographic information. So perhaps many of you know, more recently we had a census survey in 2021. And that provided a really good set of information as to the population of the UK. And we could use GIS to compare how the population has changed since the previous 2011 survey. Or we could go back even further to 2001 and so on. So we could use GIS to understand how our population, how our society is changing, and important to see where it's changing as well. Are we seeing rural to urban migration? Are we seeing higher rates of unemployment linked to perhaps areas of deprivation? We can really understand the spatial patterns that are coming through in our population. Similar for things like land use or land cover. Again, sometimes from satellites, we can do things like map growing cities or changing agricultural areas. And as I mentioned earlier on, GIS perhaps had a little bit of a spotlight during the COVID pandemic. And quite often in the government daily briefings that we saw on TV, we had those choropleth maps showing us the spread of the virus and how that had been changing over time. Again, what was going on there was GIS, for kind of a health geography application. It was about analysing those spatial processes and thinking about, importantly, how to visualise that spatial data for the public. And there's lots of considerations that GISers and kind of cartographers need to make there. What data classification do I use? Do I go up in hundreds, 200s? How does that change the map? What colour schemes to apply? That's a really important consideration in thinking about how someone might interpret the map that they're reading, especially if they're communicating it to kind of not a non-geography public audience. So, we really saw kind of the applications of GIS and health geography there. And that was really key for decision making. The medical science there and the policy, in a way, was being underpinned by that geographical understanding, those spatial processes. And kind of sticking with the health geographies theme and the human geography theme, and thinking long before the time of computers, one of the first forms of kind of spatial analysis and thematic mapping is often said to have been undertaken in Victorian London by Dr. John Snow, not the Game of Thrones character, but the Victorian medic, who was looking at cholera cases in Soho. And John Snow's what became known as the ghost map mapped cholera-related deaths, and it almost was a bit like a spatial bar chart. So it was a really interesting mapping approach, and that went a long way in supporting John Snow's theory that cholera was a waterborne disease, which we know now to be true, whereas at the time it was believed to have been an airborne disease. So GIS was, or that kind of spatial thinking was used to kind of change perceptions and people's understanding there.
Fantastic. So many different examples of where GIS is used in human and physical geography. And actually, yes, although we think of it as computers and very modern, actually that way of spatially looking at data and recording has been going on for a long time, as you just kind of suggested there about cholera. So how do you use, or how have you used GIS in your research, and why?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough really to work on a number of different research projects as varied as the applications I've just been having a chat about. But in particular, my research interest is in the areas of kind of hydrology, climate and water resources. In my doctorate, I worked on a project which used GIS and spatial analytical methods to really start to understand the relationship between large-scale climate systems, things like the North Atlantic Oscillation or the East Atlantic pattern, and how they influence rainfall patterns across Great Britain using new spatial data sets. And then looking at how those different rainfall patterns work their way through the water cycle, through the hydrological cycle, and result in stream flow in river catchments. So naturally, kind of as trying to understand that, lots and lots of maps were produced to show the different kind of hydrological and meteorological conditions under different kind of climate scenarios. And we really started to reveal how the influence of those large scale climate systems, and in turn how they affect things like the location and the speed of the jet stream, results in different rainfall and stream flow conditions in different parts of the country. What climate conditions result in perhaps the far northwest of Scotland having lots of rainfall and very high kind of flashy river catchments, compared to perhaps what's going on in southern England. Things like at the moment, this very hot weather is being driven by a certain combination of climate systems. And so the goal of that research really was to use GIS and use spatial analyses to understand those relationships, to help with forecasting research, and to hopefully lead to better informed water and environmental management decision making. For example, if we knew that a climate system was moving towards a certain phase, and that phase is associated with very high rainfall in northwest Scotland, we would know to put flood alerts up in those areas. Another side to my research explores really how we can use information and imagery gathered by satellites, as I was just sort of talking about, but to help with water resources management, and particularly in areas across the global south. For example, we can use those same satellite images as we were using to monitor deforestation to look at surface water storage in kind of key reservoirs, for example, around Cape Town. We could use those satellite imagery to look at the changes in the reservoir water storage, which led up to the day zero crisis not that long ago. Or we could look at how vegetation behaves in a time of drought, and then how it recovers again following rainfall. So there's lots and lots of potential applications for those sorts of remotely sent satellite imagery to help with water resources management. And I've been lucky enough to be able to work with organisations like UNESCO and their integrated hydrological programme to support the GIS and remote sensing training of environmental management professionals in Africa. And it's been a real privilege to be a part of that work.
Brilliant. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about some of this kind of the work you've just suggested. Just talked about, if we maybe start with South Africa, my students learn about Cape Town Day Zero and how that came from really low reservoir waters. How do you actually use GIS? Is it that you look at a range of photos? Why is GIS rather than just kind of like satellite imagery?
I suppose it moves into the realms of GIS is when you're starting to kind of quantify. You can use the images to extract out water bodies, and so if you had the extent of those water bodies and quantify that changing over time, I suppose that's when you start to move into the realm of GIS, as opposed to, like you say, just looking at kind of images or image interpretation. I suppose in my mind, it's about using those images to start to quantify and then be able to communicate that and go into the decision-making territory. There's kind of a chain there, I think, that you go through. But any good GIS project would start in exactly like you and your students doing, as looking at the data you've got available, starting to think about it, and then you can start to analyze and kind of quantify.
And how did you kind of get into researching that? Was it that you were interested? Obviously, you're kind of interested in kind of water management and hydrology. Did you feel there was like a gap in understanding it? How did you actually decide to kind of research that and then go on to advise decision makers about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I suppose I got into the world of GIS and remote sensing through my studies, through my undergraduate degrees in geography, and really, I suppose my research started to move into that territory. I found it quite interesting, this idea that we could use this data gathered by satellites to, kind of understand the hydrological cycle, as it were. So I kind of pursued that line of research, and there was sort of a growing movement, especially linked to UNESCO, that all of this data is freely available. It's produced by NASA, the European Space Agency, so it's all out there. But people don't necessarily always have the skills to be able to work with that data and to be able to use it as part of their day-to-day roles. So really, there was this kind of big push through organisations like UNESCO to start to say, okay, this data is available. How can we start to train people? How can we work with them to kind of close that skills gap and really build capacity for that, especially in areas like South America and Africa? So it's sort of a big kind of upskilling training push led by UNESCO initially.
Fantastic. So say on this the South Africa reservoir near Cape Town, so people have been like local people who monitor water around there anyway, have been kind of trained on looking at kind of your satellites and GIS. How would that then, is it that the reservoir then shrinks and then they have to implement some water saving measures? Could you explain how that kind of decision making in this example might be implemented?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think it's generally remote sensing, and that this use of GIS in this way is all about kind of adding to that ongoing monitoring effort. Let's say we can capture those images roughly every 10 days to 14 days at absolute tops. So we can kind of almost get this almost real time data kind of coming through. So we can be constantly monitoring things like reservoirs. We could be monitoring vegetation, which might be an indication that things are starting to dry up. And that's really, really important from satellites in places like Africa, because they don't have necessarily really sophisticated monitoring networks like we perhaps do in the UK or Europe or America. So they rely on that kind of satellite information. So I think it's about adding to that sort of monitoring effort, keeping an eye on those water levels decreasing. And then as that happens, that can then feed into water resources policy. If we detect a reservoir level drop of 10%, that could be a sign that we're entering into a significant drought period. And so we might then start to kind of implement water saving measures. What do we need to do? Do we need to start to reduce demand? Do we need to kind of start getting some information campaigns out there? So it's all about kind of going into that sort of monitoring environment, and then how that follows through to kind of things like local governments and things.
Fantastic. And from my understanding, anyways, that Cape Town through day zero were using GIS to actually monitor people's actually individual water uses, because they had to set limits of, I think, up to 25 litres of water per day per person. And actually they were using GIS in terms of individual households, almost to name and shame, I think, in some ways, but kind of it can be used in multiple ways in terms of our management.
Yes. Yes, yeah, absolutely. There was some research undertaken a few years ago which looked at kind of spatial patterns in smart meter water usage. So they were looking at the patterns of water use, and also what kind of resulted in changed behaviours. Was it this kind of this hard limit of you're allowed 25 litres a day, which changed over time? Did that actually result in kind of a drop in water usage based on that kind of smart meter data? Or was it actually in response to that almost like fear mongering campaign? Was it the hard restrictions, or was it Cape Town is going to run out of water? That kind of disaster style messaging. And so it was the research was looking at whether, was it the restrictions which crept in gradually, a bit like COVID lockdowns, I suppose, or was it that kind of disaster style messaging? What actually led to the drop? And it seemed the biggest drop in the kind of spatial patterns in water usage was more linked to that kind of communication campaign than it was the earlier restrictions. So it was really interesting to see the sorts of spatial patterns there.
And just kind of final question on Cape Town, maybe before we talk about your other research, is in terms of water management, you've said that this is freely available from NASA, I believe, the kind of satellite images. What is maybe the benefit of kind of, first of all, would you say GIS is expensive as a tool to be able to use? And is it something that can be implemented more globally instead of kind of these kind of hard technological solutions to water shortages?
Yeah, so GIS can be expensive, I think, is the way of phrasing it, because whilst there are sort of big commercial companies like Esri that kind of sell their GIS software as a commercial product, there are also lots of free versions of that software. There's things like QGIS, which is used especially a lot in the global south, because they can't afford the hefty license costs that come with the commercial software. So there are sort of free versions of the software, and there is data that's being made freely available through organizations like NASA or the European Space Agency. Indeed, one of the proposed policies of Donald Trump when he was president was to start charging for Landsat data. And that kind of triggered this really big kind of uproar amongst the scientific community. It's sort of like, well, that'd be fine if you were working in a big research institute in America that could just afford the imagery. But for large parts of the world that rely on this for things like environmental management and many other applications, that they wouldn't have access to that. And so it is all quite political, but it can be free. I think the big question really is, whilst it's accessible, do people necessarily have the skills? And that's where organisations like UNESCO and things can kind of come in. So I think in lots of countries we're seeing sort of GIS remote sensing being used in this way, often alongside kind of monitoring networks where possible. But for many parts of the world, especially more remote areas, it is the kind of way of monitoring environmental change.
Fantastic. And if we just, if anybody does have any questions, please do chip in on the comments, and you can, I'll ask them as well. If we go back to the first research, which was looking at climate patterns and the impact on the hydrological cycle, and potentially the impacts mainly, was it in the UK mainly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of data, like the kind of global climate. Was it just you that was working on it? How accessible, how easy is it to understand this huge amount of data? And how did you kind of link that kind of global atmospheric to more like local drainage basins? Seems very kind of different scales and complex to find out.
I mean, it was, I sort of made a rod for my own back, really, because it was looking across those scales, which was the more interesting bit to me, and being able to work with those spatial data sets. Because I think I came into that research being a kind of a keen GIS person rather than necessarily a super hydrologist. That kind of evolved with the research. So yeah, it was. Whilst I kind of led on the research, as you would in undertaking a PhD, I was supported by a small team of colleagues who kind of supervised me and held my hand through it. But yeah, it was relying really on GIS as being a really powerful tool to be able to understand those spatial patterns and also kind of make sense of those really big data sets. We were working with monthly rainfall and river flow data sets from 1900 to 2015, so about 115, 116 years of monthly time series data. So the volume there was really big, and so it was using GIS to kind of condense that, cluster things together, and help us be able to understand those changes without having to look at 116 times 12, several thousand maps all in one go. So it was using GIS to kind of consolidate and pick out key patterns and trends from those really large data sets.
Fantastic, thank you. And so if we go on to maybe your tips for GI for students, what tips do you have? What advice can you give for students using GIS, for example, in fieldwork?
Yeah, so I think that there's lots of ways that school students and teachers can start to use GIS in their work. Geography by its definition is about exploring and understanding spatial processes, and GIS is the tool to do that. For example, when learning about cities and changing places, you might explore some of the latest census data, which is available for an interactive web map on the Office of National Statistics. Or when studying rivers and coasts and climate change, you might look at some of those interactive flood risk maps produced by the Environment Agency. So I think it's having a good look online and a good Google to try and find those interactive maps and start to have a play. I think that's a really good starting point for exploring GIS. And then kind of beyond that, then there are a number of different GIS platforms that are available in schools. I think one in particular that's worth mentioning is ArcGIS Online, which is now free for all secondary geographers. And using some of those more sophisticated GIS platforms like ArcGIS, it's possible to begin to make your own maps, using some spatial data sets. For example, whilst learning about tectonic hazards, you might start to map the location of earthquakes and volcanoes and overlay that, put on top the plate tectonic boundaries. And that would help you start to understand the distribution of those geological hazards and start to understand the physical processes at play there. So you'd be able to start making your own maps as you grow more confident over time. I think the key thing, though, is to start small in whatever you do and then build it up as you become more confident. And I think that that's true for everybody. It's true for students, teachers, university students. It's certainly how I learned, start small and then build it up to looking at ridiculously big climate patterns across scales. And I think there's especially a lot of potential now to use GIS as part of fieldwork. Through platforms like ArcGIS, you can download apps on your phone. For ArcGIS, they're called Survey 123 or Arc Collector. And what's really great about those is that as you undertake and record your survey or your measurements in the field, whether that be, doing a population survey and going around and asking people, or I don't know, measuring pebbles along Chesil Beach, whatever it is, you can collect that data on your phone, and the apps will automatically record your location in the background. And quite often they can even work without an internet connection. So if you're up on rural Dartmoor with no phone signal, you can still use these kind of tools in your fieldwork. And I think what's really great is that when you're back in the classroom, you sign into the computer and your results are already there, plotted up on a map for you to explore. And what's great about that is that you don't have to worry about getting your clipboard wet, losing your data sheet. We've all done that. Or having to spend ages typing up results when you're back in the classroom. Instead you can be focusing on exploring your fieldwork data set that you've collected, looking at your different questions if you're doing a survey, producing maps and graphs. And I think they would be really perfect additions to any kind of coursework or NEA that you're working on.
Brilliant. And I think that actually sometimes, particularly younger students, might not realise that they're doing some sort of GIS when they actually start to do kind of hand-drawn maps and kind of layer information on them as well. And yeah, those Survey 123 and Collector apps are really, really fantastic. Saves a lot of time. You don't need to worry about losing your data. We definitely encourage our students to do it just because it pinpoints to that location. So then you can really kind of spatially analyse, which is really fantastic. Sometimes just my kind of final question, if anybody has any other questions, and then I've got kind of one more in your career. Sometimes we talk about kind of GIS as having layers so that we can like spatially kind of analyze it. What is the benefit of kind of seeing data in layers, maybe like on top of a map? I know we've kind of mentioned this before, but just maybe for like our younger students listening.
Yeah, I think what GIS and kind of say layering those different spatial data sets really on top of each other is that it really allows you to kind of compare different features and how they might change across a city or across a country, and really start to bring that information together. I think a geographer's key skill really is taking lots of different data sets and then bringing that all together to get a really good understanding about a specific location. And I think that's a real superpower of a geographer that you don't get in other disciplines. And the uniqueness is that spatial element. We're looking at all these different factors for different places and understanding how that changes over space and over time as well. So I think, yeah, that's a real skill of geographers, and GIS is the tool for doing that. It's taking all those different layers and using it to really understand a place.
Fantastic. That was a really lovely kind of summary. So we have been asking our guests, every guest, about kind of how they got to where they were, and do you have any advice for students taking their next steps? So we'd love to hear how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I think I initially took a slight detour from geography. I did my A levels, and then I actually started a politics degree. Not really sure why. I think it was because I did well at politics A level, and I think slightly better than geography. And so I think that was my driver, which in hindsight, and the advice I'd give is don't make your decision based only on that. Came to university, kind of experienced that, and it wasn't quite for me. And so then I made the curveball, not to human geography, which would be the logical thing to do, but to physical geography, which was always, I think, really where my heart was in terms of my studies in school. And I've pretty much refused to leave ever since. And so I've stayed at the university. I finished my undergraduate degree, and then I went on to do a a master's degree, which is a follow-on from an undergraduate, and I did that via what's called a master's by research. And so it was a research-oriented master's degree. So I essentially did a really big NEA for that, and then I started doing a little bit of teaching in GIS at the time, and that's kind of grown ever since, really, to where I am now. I've just finished my PhD, which was the kind of climate systems research, and have taken on a full-time teaching role here. So I've just kind of drifted into where I am now, largely through a bit of stubbornness and refusing to leave. But it's such a rewarding role, and I love working with our undergraduate students. And so my advice would be, really think about what options you want to pursue. As I think I based my decision in hindsight more on grade rather than what I really enjoyed. So think about what you want to do carefully, but it's never too late to kind of change your mind. If you do go into something and you think, well, that's actually not quite for me, this isn't quite what I expected, especially if you're making a big commitment like choosing to study at university, it's never too late to go back to your geographical roots if you want to.
Fantastic. That is really, really great advice, particularly about not just going for the kind of top grades and actually like following what you want to do. And also that you can always change your mind. That's also very important. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much on being a guest. It's been you've been so informative on the different the many different ways we can use GIS in geographical research, from human to physical, and then really kind of looking at some of the ways you have used GIS as well. So thank you so much for being a guest, and it's been fantastic to have you as a guest.
No, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Brilliant. And I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody. So thanks for coming and thanks for watching, and check out online on Time for Geography. There'll be a shortened kind of highlight video of this as well, or curiosity booster as they're now called, and there's other past ones up there as well, so please do check those out. And from me and Harry as well, enjoy the rest of your evening, and looking forward to seeing you soon.